The whiskey sat untouched in the glass amber liquid, catching the last rays of August sun as it died over the Kansas prairie. James Brennan, 72 years old with hands gnarled from a lifetime of ranch work, stared at that glass like it held answers instead of bourbon. His grandson stood beside the porch railing, fresh army uniforms still creased sharp from the box hands trembling just enough for an old man to notice. "You scared?" James asked. Clayton Brennan II turned from watching the horizon. 22 years old, built like his great-grandfather, but with eyes that hadn't yet seen what war could do to a man. "Yes, sir." James nodded once. Honesty deserved respect. He picked up the glass, took one small sip, and set it back down with the care of a man who knew whiskey could be friend or enemy, depending on the day. "The first time I saw your great-grandmother," James said, his voice carrying that particular quality of memory, turned to story. "She climbed down from a wagon right there at that gate. August of 1878. She didn't have nothing but a carpet bag and the kind of determination that could move mountains if mountains had the sense to get out of her way." Clayton pulled a chair closer, settling in. Tomorrow he would board a bus that would take him to Camp Pendleton, then to a war in Korea that nobody seemed to understand, but everybody had to fight. Tonight he had his grandfather and whatever wisdom the old man deemed worth sharing. "What was she doing here?" Clayton asked. James looked out across the ranch, across land that had been in the family for 72 years, across buildings and fences, and the life his parents had built from nothing. "She came to survive, but she did a hell of a lot more than that." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and spoke the words that would begin the story. "She came to cook for the ranch hands, but she ended up running everything, including your great-grandfather's heart." The old man's eyes went distant, looking not at the present, but at an August day 7 decades gone, and the past opened like a door. August 1878 came to Kansas territory with heat that could kill a man if he wasn't careful, and had already killed the land, whether it was careful or not. 4 months without rain had turned the prairie grass from gold to gray, cracked the earth into patterns like broken pottery, and reduced the creek that ran through Clayton Brennan's ranch to a string of stagnant pools that bred mosquitoes and desperation in equal measure. Clayton stood at the window of his ranch office, 25 years old, and feeling 50, watching his cattle pick at dried grass that held about as much nutrition as the dust that covered it. The ledger book lay open on his desk behind him, numbers that told a story he didn't want to read. 20 men to feed. Cattle prices down from $18 a head to $12. Feed costs doubled. Water hauled from 5 miles away at $1 per barrel. 3 months until bankruptcy if something didn't change. The wagon appeared as a dust cloud first rolling down the rutted road from Linden like a small tornado made of Kansas dirt in summer heat. Clayton watched it come, noting details the way a rancher learned to note things that might matter. Not a freight wagon, not traveling fast enough. Single horse tired, driver alone. The dust settled and the wagon stopped at his gate, and Clayton saw that the driver was a woman. She climbed down without hesitation, without looking around for help, boots hitting the ground with the solid certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, even if nobody else did. Dark blonde hair pulled back, severe traveling dress, covered in 3 days' worth of road dust, and eyes that even from 50 yards away looked like they'd seen things that would make a weaker person quit. She didn't waste time, didn't pat down her dress or check her appearance, or do any of the things women usually did. She walked straight to where Sam Tucker, the ranch foreman, was mending a section of split-rail fence, and Clayton watched her talk to Sam with the kind of direct communication that suggested she'd already decided this was business, not social calling. Sam, 45 years old and not easily impressed, listened, nodded, and pointed toward the main house. Toward Clayton. The woman turned. Even across the distance, Clayton could see the intelligence in her face, the assessment happening behind those coffee-colored eyes. She was evaluating him the same way he was evaluating her, two people taking measure of each other before a word got spoken. She crossed the yard with purpose, stepping around horse droppings and over a coil of rope without looking down, awareness of her surroundings built into movement rather than conscious thought. This woman had worked before, worked hard, worked in places where you watched your step or paid the price. "Mr. Brennan," she called out when she was close enough that she wouldn't have to shout. Her voice carried clear and strong, despite what must have been a bone-deep weariness from days on rough roads. "I'm Margaret Hartwell. I understand you need a cook." Clayton came down the porch steps slow, using the time to study this unexpected arrival. Advertisements for a ranch cook had gone out to newspapers in Linden, Kansas City, and as far as St. Louis. He'd expected letters of inquiry, maybe someone showing up in a month or two. Not this. Most women who came west alone were running from something or running towards something, and the desperation hung on them like cheap perfume. This woman had desperation in her bones. Clayton could see it in the tightness around her eyes, in the way she held herself, like letting go of control for even a second might break her completely. But she also had something else, something that looked like steel wrapped in flesh. "I did place an advertisement," Clayton acknowledged, stopping at a respectful distance, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to show he understood boundaries. "But I expected responses through the mail, not someone showing up unannounced." Margaret Hartwell lifted her chin, and Clayton saw pride there. The kind of pride that came from having everything stripped away and refusing to surrender to the stripping. "I don't have time for letters and negotiations, Mr. Brennan. I need employment immediately, and you need a cook. I can prepare meals for large crews. I can work with limited supplies. And I can start today if you'll have me." There was a tremor beneath the steel in her voice, small enough that a careless man might miss it, but Clayton caught it clean. She wasn't exaggerating about immediacy. Whatever had brought her here, it was chasing. Close to Hemo. He glanced at Sam, who drifted near enough to listen. The foreman shrugged, a gesture that meant the decision sat squarely on the boss's shoulders, where it belonged. The afternoon sun beat down on all three of them. Sweat traced lines through the dust on Margaret Hartwell's face. Her hands, Clayton noticed, showed calluses. Real work calluses, not the kind you got from needlepoint or light gardening. This woman knew labor. "Where are you coming from?" Clayton asked. "St. Louis?" No hesitation, no embellishment. "My husband died 6 months ago. The debts he left behind took everything. I have no family, no prospects, and considerable skill in a kitchen. I saw your advertisement in the Kansas City newspaper 2 weeks ago and have been traveling since." The bluntness impressed him more than any amount of pleading would have. No tears, no elaborate story designed to earn sympathy, just facts delivered with the kind of practical resignation that Clayton understood in his bones. Kansas didn't have room for people who couldn't look reality in the face and keep moving anyway. "The pay is $30 a month," Clayton said. "Room and board included. You'll have a cabin to yourself, small but private. You'll be responsible for 3 meals a day for the hands, plus whatever I need at the main house. The men work hard and they eat accordingly. Can you handle that?" "I can handle that and more," Margaret said, and there was no boast in her tone, just simple confidence in her own capability. Clayton made his decision the way he made most decisions, quick and based on gut instinct, that had kept him alive through drought and winter storms and the simple grinding difficulty of building something from nothing. "Then welcome to the ranch, Mrs. Hartwell. Sam will show you to your cabin and the cookhouse. We eat at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. I expect you'll need some time to familiarize yourself with the supplies and equipment." "I'll have supper ready at 6, Margaret said firmly. Not a promise, but a statement of fact. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan." She turned to follow Sam before Clayton could respond, and he watched her walk away with that same determined grace, spine straight, despite what had to be exhaustion deep enough to reach bone. Something stirred in his chest, something he'd thought died and buried 5 years ago, when his young wife Sarah had succumbed to fever, leaving him alone in this big house with nothing but work and memories to fill the empty spaces. Clayton shook his head and returned to his office, but he found concentration impossible. The ledger numbers blurred together as his mind kept circling back to the image of Margaret Hartwell climbing down from that wagon, all fierce determination and barely concealed desperation. He knew that combination well enough. It was written into the soil of Kansas, into every homestead and ranch that struggled against drought and low prices and harsh winters, in the simple grinding reality of trying to build something lasting in a place that seemed determined to break anyone foolish enough to tramping. At 6 o'clock, precisely drawn by the ringing of the cookhouse bell, Clayton walked across the yard and stopped dead in the doorway. The transformation stunned him. The long tables that usually held battered tin plates now showed actual dishware, mismatched but clean. The smell that filled the air made his mouth water instantly. Proper cooking, instead of the charred meat and watery beans the men had been choking down since old Cookie had died last spring. Margaret stood at the massive wood stove, her traveling dress now protected by a work apron, hair still pulled back severe but with small curls escaping around her face from the heat. She ladled stew into a serving pot, and beside it sat fresh biscuits, golden and perfect steam rising from their split tops. The ranch hands filed in behind Clayton, their usual rowdy conversation dying away as they caught the scent. Sam Tucker let out a low whistle of pure appreciation. Tommy Harlow, barely 17 and still growing into his lanky frame, looked like he might start crying from sheer joy. "Gentlemen," Margaret said, turning to face them with the ladle still in her hand, "supper is ready. I expect you to wash your hands before you eat at my tables, and I expect you to behave like civilized human beings while you're eating. Anyone who wants seconds is welcome to them, but there will be no waste. Am I understood?" There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Sam grinned in an expression that made his weathered face look 10 years younger. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and headed immediately to the wash basins. The other hands followed suit, and Clayton found himself impressed all over again. She'd taken command of the cookhouse in less than 6 hours, established rules and expectations with the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught. You either had it or you didn't, and Margaret Hartwell clearly had it. Clayton washed his hands and took his usual seat at the head of the long table, watching as Margaret served the men with efficient grace. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, real flavor, instead of the burnt offering they'd been enduring. The biscuits were light and buttery, and there was even coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of muddy water with grounds. The hands ate with the kind of focused intensity that spoke better than any words about the quality of the meal. Conversation stayed minimal, just requests for passing bowls and the occasional grunt of satisfaction. "Mrs. Hartwell," Clayton said when the initial feeding frenzy had slowed enough for all talk, "this is exceptional." "Thank you, Mr. Brennan." She refilled his coffee cup, movements practiced and sure. "I found your pantry adequately stocked, though I'll need to make a list of items for your next trip to town." "Whatever you need," Clayton said, and meant it. If she could produce meals like this consistently, he would buy her the moon if she asked for it. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt almost miraculous after months of barely edible food. Margaret proved as good as her word, producing hearty breakfast before dawn, substantial midday meals and suppers that had the hands looking forward to the end of their workday with new enthusiasm. But Clayton began to notice she was doing more than just cooking. On the third day, he found her in the chicken coop reorganizing the laying boxes and muttering to herself about efficiency. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this work before, dismantling the old arrangement and rebuilding it with a 15-degree slope that would let eggs roll gently into collection trays instead of getting trampled or hidden. On the fifth day, she was examining the vegetable garden that had been left to grow wild, making notes on a piece of paper with the careful attention of someone planning a campaign rather than planting vegetables. On the seventh day, she appeared at his office door with a list that made his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. "What is this?" Clayton asked, scanning the detailed itemization that covered 3 pages of careful handwriting. "It's what you need to run this ranch properly." Margaret said, her tone suggesting she would brook no argument on the matter. Clayton read through the pages slowly. The first detailed cookhouse equipment, every item explained with costs and expected improvements. The wood stove was wasting 30% of fuel through gaps that leaked heat. The icebox needed better insulation. The knives were dangerously dull. Total cost to repair or replace $45. The second page addressed supply ordering with the kind of systematic analysis Clayton had never thought to apply to buying flour and beans. She'd identified waste in their purchasing patterns, proposed bulk ordering with quantity discounts, and estimated savings of $8 to $12 monthly. The third page covered the garden and poultry operation. The garden could provide 40% of their vegetables if properly managed, saving $15 a month. The chicken coop repairs would increase egg production from 12 to 35 per week. She even suggested acquiring 2 hogs to process food waste, providing meat for winter. "You think you can fix all of this?" Clayton asked, looking up from the papers. "I know I can," Margaret said, and he saw no arrogance in her expression, just certainty born from experience. Clayton leaned back in his chair, studying her. He'd built this ranch from nothing over 12 years, had fought drought and debt and every imaginable setback. He recognized value when he saw it, and Margaret Hartwell represented value beyond simple cooking skills. "Do what needs doing," he said simply. "If you need money, come to me. If you need the hands to help with heavy work, tell Sam. But understand that if you take this on, I'll hold you accountable for the results." Margaret smiled, and it transformed her face from merely determined to genuinely beautiful. "I would expect nothing less, Mr. Brennan." She was gone before he could respond, and Clayton sat alone in his office, wondering what exactly he'd just set in motion. The answer became clear over the following weeks as Margaret Hartwell systematically took over the organizational aspects of ranch life that Clayton had been too busy or too indifferent to manage properly. She reorganized the pantry with ruthless efficiency, creating a system that made it easy to see what supplies were running low. She took over the ordering, dealing directly with the merchants in Linden and negotiating prices with a shrewdness that impressed even Frank Morrison, the mercantile owner who'd been overcharging the ranch for years. Clayton accompanied her on the first supply run, more curious than anything about how she'd handle Morrison. The merchant had given him the usual pricing, $2.50 per bag of flour, and Clayton had nodded acceptance the way he always did. Margaret studied the bags, then looked Morrison in the eye. 25 bags cash payment today. What's your price?" Morrison blinked, clearly not expecting negotiation from the new cook. 250 per bag, same as always." "You sold to the Anderson Ranch for 220 last week," Margaret said calmly. "I'm buying more than they did." Morrison's surprise showed clear on his face. "How did she know the Anderson pricing 225? That's as low as I go. 220 and I commit to monthly orders for 1 year." Morrison looked at Clayton, clearly seeking backup. Clayton just shrugged. "She's doing the negotiating." The merchant sighed, but Clayton could see calculation behind his eyes. Guaranteed monthly business from the Brennan Ranch was worth a small reduction in margin. 220 it is, Mrs. Hartwell. You drive a hard bargain." "I drive a fair bargain, Mr. Morrison. You'll still make profit, just not quite as much as you're used to." The savings were small per transaction, but they added up. $7.50 on that flour order alone. Over a year, Margaret's negotiating skills would save the ranch close to $100, maybe more. She revitalized the vegetable garden, enlisting young Tommy to help with the heavy digging in exchange for extra desserts. Soon, fresh greens and herbs were appearing on the table, reducing costs and improving meals simultaneously. She even tackled the ranch's chaotic record-keeping, pointing out to Clayton that he was losing track of expenses and income in ways that could become serious problems. "You're a rancher, not an accountant," she said one evening when she appeared at his office with yet another list of suggestions. "But you need someone who can manage the business side of things properly." "And that someone is you?" Clayton asked, though there was curiosity in his voice rather than challenge. "My husband was a merchant," Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. "I handled his books for 8 years. I know how to track income and expenses, how to project seasonal variations, how to identify problems before they become catastrophic. Let me help you, Mr. Brennan." Clayton looked at the ledgers spread across his desk, evidence of his own inadequacy in this area staring him in the face. The decision felt both risky and absolutely right. "Show me what you can do." That night began a partnership that would transform not just the ranch's operations, but something deeper. Something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Margaret spent evenings in Clayton's office, going through years of poorly maintained records, creating systems and projections that revealed the ranch's actual financial position. It was better than Clayton had feared, but worse than he'd hoped, and her frank assessment felt like relief after years of muddling through on instinct and hope. They worked side-by-side conversations, moving gradually from purely business matters to more personal topics. Clayton found himself telling her about Sarah, about the fever that had taken her so suddenly, about the guilt he still carried for not being able to save her. Margaret listened without offering empty platitudes, and when she shared her own story, he understood why. "Robert wasn't a good man," she said quietly one evening, her pen still moving across the ledger page. "I married him because I was young and foolish and thought I had no other options. He was charming at first, but the charm hid debts and gambling and a dozen other vices. When he died, I thought I would finally be free. Instead, I discovered his debts were now mine by law, if not by justice. Everything we owned was seized. I had nothing left but my skills and my determination not to let his mistakes destroy me." "You could have remarried," Clayton said carefully. "A woman with your abilities would have had options." Margaret looked up at him, her brown eyes fierce in the lamplight. I will never put myself under another man's control like that again. Whatever I build now, I build for myself. The words should have been off-putting, should have made Clayton defensive. Instead, he found them admirable. There was a strength in Margaret Hartwell that matched the strength required to survive in Kansas, a refusal to surrender to circumstances that he recognized in his own bones. I respect that, he said simply, and the look she gave him held surprise and something that might have been the first stirrings of trust. 4 weeks after Margaret's arrival on an afternoon when Clayton was checking fence posts in the north pasture, Sam Tucker came riding up fast. "Boss, we got a problem." Clayton straightened, reading trouble in Sam's expression. "What kind?" "Man at the ranch house, drunk, asking for Mrs. Hartwell. She told him to leave, he's not leaving. Getting belligerent." Clayton was on his horse before Sam finished talking, both men riding hard toward the main buildings. As they got closer, Clayton could hear a raised voice and his jaw tightened. Margaret stood in the yard between the cookhouse and her cabin, facing down a man on horseback. Even from a distance, Clayton could see the sway in the rider's posture that spoke of too much whiskey consumed too early in the day. "I told you to leave," Margaret was saying, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You have no business here, Chester." "I have business with you, Bao," the man said, words slurred but still understandable. "You think you can just run off and leave your obligations behind? You owe me money, Margaret. Robert owed me money and that debt passed to you." "I owe you nothing," Margaret snapped. "Robert's gambling debts died with him, and you know it." "Maybe legally," Chester said, and even drunk there was a mean edge to his voice. "But morally you think you can just start over like none of it happened? I want what I'm owed." Clayton rode into the yard and dismounted in one smooth motion, positioning himself between Margaret and the mounted man. Sam was right behind him, and Tommy appeared from the barn, followed by 2 more hands. "I think the lady has made herself clear," Clayton said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that often preceded violence. "You need to leave." Chester focused on Clayton with difficulty, his bloodshot eyes struggling to make sense of this new element. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm Clayton Brennan, and this is my ranch. Mrs. Hartwell works for me, which means she's under my protection. Whatever disputes you think you have with her, you can take them up with a lawyer or the sheriff. But you're not going to settle them here. Now get moving before I have my men remove you." The threat wasn't empty. Sam had his hand near the pistol on his hip. Tommy held a shovel like he knew how to use it as a weapon. The other hands had spread out, forming a loose semicircle that cut off easy escape routes. Chester looked around, doing the math. 5 men, all sober, all ready. Him alone and drunk. The calculation showed clear on his flushed face. "This isn't over," he muttered, but he was already turning his horse. "You think you can hide behind your new boss forever, Margaret? What happens when he gets tired of you?" "Leave," Clayton said, and the single word carried enough weight that Chester kicked his horse into motion, weaving slightly as he rode toward the gate. They watched until he was out of sight, dust settling in his wake. Only then did Clayton turn to Margaret, who was shaking with reaction, arms wrapped around herself. "You all right?" "Yes." Her voice was steady, but the tremor in her hands gave lie to the calm. "I apologize. I didn't think anyone from my old life would follow me here." "Come inside," Clayton said gently. "We need to talk about this." Margaret hesitated, pride warring with practicality, then nodded. They went to his office while Sam dismissed the hands, sending them back to their work with quiet words of reassurance. Clayton poured a small glass of whiskey, despite Margaret's protests. "Drink it. You've had a shock." She obeyed, coughing slightly at the burn, but color returned to her cheeks. Clayton sat across from her, giving her time to settle before asking questions. "Chester Blake," Margaret said finally, unprompted. "He was Robert's closest friend and worst influence. They gambled together, drank together, lost money together. When Robert died, Chester tried to claim I owed him for various supposed loans and debts. I proved to the courts in St. Louis that I had no legal obligation. The statute of limitations had expired on anything Robert might have owed, but Chester never accepted it. "How much does he claim you owe?" $300. The amount came out bitter. "Money I don't have for debts I never incurred. Chester blames me for Robert's death somehow, as if I caused the heart attack that killed him." Clayton thought about the amount. $300 was substantial, but not impossible. He thought about Margaret's pride, her fierce independence, the careful way she wasn't asking him for help, even though the request hung unspoken in the air between them. I'll handle Chester Blake, Clayton said. No, Margaret said immediately. This is my problem, not yours. You work for me, which makes it my problem when someone shows up drunk, making threats. Clayton kept his voice level reasonable. Let me handle this my way. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something that went beyond employer and employee, beyond simple friendship. Margaret nodded slowly, accepting his protection, even as he could see it cost her pride to do so. The porch boards creaked as James Brennan shifted his weight, bringing himself back to the present. His grandson watched him with the kind of attention young men gave to stories when they sensed the story mattered more than entertainment. So that was the first time Chester showed up? Clayton asked. First of 3 times, James confirmed, each one worse than the last. But your great-grandfather, he understood something important. What's that? That somebody means protecting people isn't about being loud or making threats. Sometimes it's about being prepared, being smart, being there when it matters. James looked at his grandson. You'll learn that in Korea if you're lucky. The loud soldiers don't necessarily survive longer than the quiet ones. Often it's the other way around. Clayton nodded slowly, processing. What happened next? What happened next is your great-grandfather started making moves. Quiet moves. While your great-grandmother kept transforming the ranch. And Chester? James paused. Chester was just getting started with his schemes. The old man stood, bones creaking in protest. But before we get to that, you should understand what was really happening. It wasn't just about Chester or money or any of that surface trouble. It was about 2 people learning to trust each other. Your great-grandfather had lost his first wife and blamed himself. Your great-grandmother had been used by her first husband and sworn never to be vulnerable again. They were both scared, just in different ways. But they got past it. They got past it because they gave it time, because they let actions speak louder than words, because they didn't rush something that needed to grow slow and strong. James put his hand on Clayton's shoulder. Tomorrow you're going to war. You're scared. That's smart. Fear keeps you alive if you use it right. But remember, this strength isn't about not being afraid. Strength is doing what needs doing despite the fear. The sun had fully set now, stars beginning to emerge in the Kansas sky. In the distance, a coyote called and another answered. Your great-grandmother came here with nothing but a carpet bag. In 4 weeks, she'd fixed the chicken coop, reorganized the supplies, started saving money, and faced down a man from her past. But the real test was still coming, because Chester was going to come back. And when he did, it would take everything both of them had to survive it. James moved toward the door. Come on, your grandmother's keeping supper warm, and we've got more story to tell before morning. Clayton followed his grandfather inside the cool darkness of the house, a relief after the day's heat. But his mind was still on that August afternoon in 1878, on a woman climbing down from a wagon with determination in her eyes, and nothing but her skills to trade for a future. He understood now why his grandfather was telling this story. Tomorrow he'd climb onto a bus with nothing but his training and his determination heading into uncertainty. Just like Margaret Hartwell had climbed down from that wagon. The question was whether he had the same kind of steel she'd had, whether he could do what needed doing when fear tried to stop him. His grandfather seemed to read his thoughts. You've got her blood in you, Clayton. That counts for something. It counts for a lot. Now come eat. Story's not finished yet, and you need to hear how it ends before you start writing your own. Supper that night was pot roast with carrots and potatoes, thick gravy over fresh biscuits, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. James Brennan watched his grandson eat with the focused intensity of a young man who'd worked up an appetite listening to stories, and he remembered his own youth well enough to know that sometimes a man needed to fill his belly before he could fill his mind with wisdom. Your great-grandmother, James said, breaking the comfortable silence, she understood something most people miss, that the hardest battles aren't the ones fought with fists or guns. They're the ones fought with patience and planning and the kind of quiet determination that outlasts any amount of noise. Clayton looked up from his plate. What happened after Chester showed up that first time? What happened is your great-grandfather did what strong men do. He protected what needed protecting, but he did it smart. James pushed his own plate aside, the food only half eaten. At 72, appetite came and went like prairie weather. Let me tell you about the months that followed. about water and trust and the kind of partnership that changes everything. The old man's eyes went distant again, and the story resumed. The evening after Chester's visit, Clayton sat in his office with the door open, watching the sun paint the western sky in shades of amber and crimson. The ledger books lay untouched on his desk. Numbers could wait. Right now, he needed to think about problems that couldn't be solved with addition and subtraction. Margaret appeared in the doorway as the last light faded, her silhouette dark against the purple dusk. She'd changed from her work dress into something simpler. Her hair still pulled back, but looser, now softer. "May I come in?" Clayton gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please." She sat with the careful posture of someone who'd been taught proper deportment and never quite shook the training, back straight, hands folded in her lap. But her eyes, when they met his, held nothing of submission. "I need to tell you about Chester," she said, "about what he is and why he's dangerous." Clayton leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the corner of his desk, in a position that would have scandalized his mother but suited the moment. "I'm listening." "Chester Blake and Robert, my late husband, they were friends from childhood. St. Louis boys who thought they were smarter than everyone else and proved themselves wrong with every decision they made." Margaret's voice held no emotion, just recitation of facts. "They gambled together, lost together, borrowed money they couldn't repay together. Robert died owing $800 to various people. Chester claimed half of that was owed to him personally." "Was it?" "No." The word came flat and certain. "Robert kept records, poor as they were. I went through everything after he died. There were no loans from Chester, no promissory notes, nothing. Chester and Robert were gambling partners, but Robert's debts were to the house, not to Chester." Clayton pulled his boots off the desk and leaned forward. "So when you said the courts ruled in your favor—" "The courts in St. Louis found no legal basis for Chester's claim. No documents, no witnesses who could swear to any loan. The statute of limitations had expired on anything that might have existed. Legally, I owed Chester Blake nothing." She paused and something flashed across her face. Fear, maybe, or old anger never quite extinguished. "But Chester doesn't care about legal. He cares about what he thinks he's owed. And he blames me for Robert's death." "How could you be responsible for a heart attack?" "Logic doesn't enter into it. Robert died the day after I told him I wanted a divorce. Chester has convinced himself that the stress killed Robert, that I murdered his friend, as surely as if I'd used a knife." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap, the only visible sign of tension. "He told me at the funeral that I'd pay for what I did. I thought he meant emotionally. I didn't realize he meant literally." Clayton stood, moved to the cabinet where he kept a pistol for emergencies, and pulled it out. The Colt 45 gleamed dull in the lamplight. He checked that it was unloaded, then set it on the desk between them. "You know how to use one of these?" Margaret looked at the gun with the kind of wariness most women showed around firearms. "I've shot tin cans a few times. My father thought I should know the basics." "Basics aren't enough." Clayton picked up the pistol, handling it with the casual familiarity of a man who'd grown up with weapons. "Tomorrow morning, before the hands are up, I'm going to teach you to shoot properly." "That's not necessary." "It is if Chester comes back when I'm not here. I'm not saying you'll need to shoot him. I'm saying you need the option." Clayton set the gun down again, and his eyes holding hers. "I don't think you're weak, Margaret. I think you're capable of handling more than most men I know. But capability without tools is just potential. I want to give you the tools." Something shifted in her expression, a softening around the eyes that might have been gratitude, or might have been the first crack in walls built high and strong. "All right, tomorrow morning." She stood to leave, then hesitated at the door. Clayton, first time she'd used his given name. He noticed, felt the shift it represented. "Thank you for today, for this, for not thinking less of me because my past followed me here." "Your past is your past," Clayton said. "What matters is what you're building now. And from where I sit, you're building something impressive." She smiled, small but genuine, and left him alone with his thoughts and a loaded question he wasn't quite ready to answer. When had Margaret Hartwell stopped being just the cook and become something more? When had protecting her stopped being simple employer's obligation and become something personal? He didn't have answers, so he did what he always did when thinking got complicated. He went to check on the horses, finding comfort in simple tasks and the quiet breathing of animals who never asked questions a man wasn't ready to face. Morning came early, the sky still more black than blue, when Clayton knocked on Margaret's cabin door. She answered immediately, already dressed in practical clothes, more suited to work than propriety, and followed him to a spot beyond the barn where gunshots wouldn't wake the entire ranch. He'd set up 6 tin cans on a fence rail targets that would give honest feedback about accuracy. The Colt 45 sat heavy in his hand as he turned to face her. First lesson, Clayton said, his voice pitched low to match the pre-dawn quiet. A gun is a tool, nothing more, nothing less. You respect it the same way you respect a sharp knife or a hot stove. It can hurt you if you're careless, but if you treat it right, it does exactly what you need. Margaret nodded, watching his hands as he demonstrated the mechanics. Load, aim, fire, reload. Simple in theory, harder in practice. Your turn. He handed her the pistol, then positioned himself behind her, close enough to correct her stance, but not touching, respecting the space between them, even as he taught. Feet shoulder width apart, knees slightly bent. You're not a statue, you're a spring. Breathe out before you squeeze the trigger. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet from the nearest can. Clayton said nothing, just handed her fresh ammunition and stepped back. The second shot was closer. The third actually grazed a can, sending it spinning. They worked for an hour as the sun climbed and painted the world in shades of gold and rose. By the end, Margaret was hitting 3 out of 6 shots, good enough for a beginner, good enough to give her a fighting chance if fighting became necessary. That's enough for today, Clayton said when he saw her hands starting to shake from fatigue. We'll practice again tomorrow. And the day after. Until it becomes muscle memory instead of conscious thought. Margaret handed back the pistol, her expression unreadable. Why are you doing this, teaching me, I mean? You could just tell me to leave, to take my problem somewhere else. Clayton took his time answering, checking the Colt's chamber and sliding it back into his belt. Because I've lost people I cared about when I wasn't prepared to protect them. And because you matter, Margaret. To the ranch, to the hands, to Mite. The last 2 words came out quieter than the rest, almost lost in the morning breeze. But she heard them. He saw it in the way her breath caught, in the slight widening of her eyes. I should get breakfast started, she said, but she didn't move immediately, just stood there looking at him with an expression that held questions neither of them was ready to ask out loud. Yeah, Clayton agreed. Me too. Got fences to check. They walked back to the ranch buildings in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Charged somehow, full of things unsaid and possibilities unexamined. Sam Tucker was already up mucking out stalls with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd done the same task 10,000 times. He watched Clayton and Margaret walk up from the practice area, noted the easy way they moved together, and said nothing. But his eyes held knowing, and when Clayton caught his glance, Sam just grinned and went back to work. 3 days later, Sam came to Clayton with news that made the Chester problem seem almost trivial by comparison. Main well's going dry. Clayton followed Sam to the well house, peered down into darkness that should have shown water reflection, and saw only damp stone 40 feet down. In another 2 weeks, maybe 3, the well would be completely dry. We got options, Clayton asked, though he already knew the answer would be expensive no matter what. 3 that I can see. Sam ticked them off on calloused fingers. Haul water from town costs about $25 a week. Drill a new well costs $200 up front, but solves it permanent. Or find a spring somewhere on the property, which is free if we're lucky and impossible if we're not. What about the Patterson place? They still got water. Garrett Sullivan's got a spring on the boundary between his land and ours. Small thing, but it runs year-round. Problem is getting to it means crossing Sullivan's property, and you know how he feels about us after that boundary dispute last year. Clayton did know. Sullivan was a hard man, 55 years old with gray beard and suspicious eyes, who'd accused Clayton of moving fence posts to steal grazing land. The accusation was false, but had poisoned relations between the ranches. Asking Sullivan for help now would mean swallowing pride, and pride sometimes felt like the only thing keeping a man upright when everything else tried to drag him down. Let me think on it, Clayton said, but thinking didn't change mathematics. $25 a week would bankrupt them in 3 months. $200 for drilling exceeded their cash reserves. Finding a spring on their own land was possible, but unlikely. That evening, working the books with Margaret, as had become their habit, Clayton explained the water situation. She listened without interrupting, making notes on a separate piece of paper as he talked through costs and options. "What about Sullivan?" she asked when he finished. "What about him? You said he has a spring. Can we negotiate access?" Clayton laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sullivan would rather drink sand than do me a favor. We had a boundary dispute last year, accusations were made, and now there's bad blood." Margaret tapped her pencil against her notes, thinking, what if we offer him something he needs? Like what? The man has a bigger spread than ours, more cattle, more money. Does he have better water management? Does he have efficient systems? Does he have someone who can help him avoid the same mistakes you've been making with your books? Clayton raised an eyebrow. You think Sullivan would agree to partnership just for business advice? No. Margaret's eyes held a gleam that Clayton was learning meant she'd seen an angle nobody else had noticed. But what if we offer him a share in the new well? We drill deep 80 feet instead of the usual 40. We hit water that will last through any drought. And we give him rights to 25% of the output. Why would we give him anything? It's our well. Because to drill that deep costs money we don't have. But if Sullivan pays for access rights, say $75, that plus our reserves gives us enough to drill. We solve our water problem, he gets guaranteed water for his future needs, and everyone wins. Clayton stared at her, seeing the logic unfold like a map drawn by someone who understood terrain better than he did. That's assuming he agrees, and assuming we find water at 80 feet. Then we make it worth his while to agree, and we hire the best water finder we can afford. Margaret met his eyes. Or we spend $25 a week until we're bankrupt. Your choice. It wasn't really a choice, and they both knew it. Sometimes the only path forward was the one that required swallowing pride and making deals with people you didn't particularly like. All right, Clayton said. Set up a meeting with Sullivan. Let's see if he's interested in your proposal. Our proposal, Margaret corrected. We're partners in this, remember, partners. The words sat strange and comfortable at the same time, like breaking in new boots that would eventually fit perfect, but needed wearing first. Garrett Sullivan's ranch sat 3 miles east, close enough to be neighborly in theory, but far enough that the two operations rarely interacted in practice. The main house was bigger than Clayton's, built of stone instead of wood, a statement of permanence and wealth. Sullivan met them on his porch with a rifle propped against the wall, not threatening but not exactly welcoming either. His gray beard caught the afternoon light, and his eyes held the wariness of a man who'd been fighting for what he had long enough that fighting became habit even when peace made more sense. "Brennan," he said, then his eyes shifted to Margaret. "Ma'am." "Mr. Sullivan." Margaret dismounted without waiting for help, which seemed to earn a flicker of respect from the older rancher. "I'm Margaret Hartwell, business manager for the Brennan Ranch. We'd like to discuss a proposal that could benefit both our operations." Sullivan's eyebrows climbed. "Business manager, thought you were the cook." "I'm both. Turns out I'm better at managing money than I am at baking pies, though the pies are nothing to sneeze at either." That got a short bark of laughter from Sullivan. "Come on up then. Let's hear this proposal." They sat at a rough-hewn table on Sullivan's porch, Margaret spreading out a hand-drawn map that showed both properties, the spring location and the proposed well site. Clayton stayed quiet, letting her handle the presentation. This was her plan, her moment. "Your spring," Margaret began, pointing to a spot where two property lines met, "runs year-round, but you can't access it without crossing Brennan land. Our well is going dry. We need water. You need guaranteed future access. I propose we solve both problems simultaneously." She explained the deep well plan, the cost-sharing, the water rights split. Sullivan listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving away nothing. When she finished, he leaned back and studied her with the kind of assessment usually reserved for evaluating cattle. "You worked all this out yourself." "I did the mathematics. Mr. Brennan will do the actual ranching. But yes, the framework is mine. And Brennan here agrees to give me 25% of a well on his own land." Clayton spoke for the first time. "If you're paying for a quarter of the drilling cost, seems fair. You get a quarter of the water. Plus it solves your access problem without either of us having to play nice when we don't feel like it." Sullivan grunted, which might have been agreement or might have been wine. $75 is a lot of money for water I might not need for years. $75 now, Margaret said. Or $200 later when your own well runs dry and you have to drill deeper. This way you're insured against drought. And you get it at a discount because we're sharing costs. The older rancher looked between them, calculation visible in his eyes. Finally, he said, I want 35%. Margaret didn't hesitate. 30% and we maintain the pump and equipment at our expense. 33%. 31% final offer. Sullivan's face split into a grin that transformed him from hostile to almost friendly. You remind me of my late wife. She could negotiate the stripes off a tiger. Deal, Mrs. Hartwell. 31% it is. They shook hands all around, and as they rode back to the ranch, Clayton felt something unfamiliar and took a moment to identify it as hope. That was impressive, he told Margaret. That was necessary, she replied. And Mr. Sullivan isn't nearly as difficult as he pretends to be. He just needed someone to give him a face-saving way to back down from his grudge. Still impressive. She smiled, and Clayton thought again about how that smile changed her whole face, softened the hard edges that life had carved into it. Thank you. Now we just need to find water at 80 feet and hope we don't go broke doing it. The drilling began a week later, a crew from Wichita with equipment that looked like it belonged in a mining operation rather than on a ranch. The bit chewed through rock and clay, going deeper than any well in the county, and every day that passed was another day's wages paid out with no guarantee of return. At 70 feet, they hit damp earth. At 75, the first trickle of water appeared. At 80, the well tapped into an underground river that filled the shaft faster than the pumps could drain it. They had water, more water than the ranch would need for a decade, cold, clean water that tasted of stone and possibility. Sullivan rode over when he heard the news, inspected the well with a professional eye, and nodded approval. Your lady manager knows her business, Brennan. You're lucky to have her. I know it, Clayton said, and realized as he said it how true the words were. Lucky didn't begin to cover what Margaret Hartwell had brought to the ranch. Lucky was finding a $20 gold piece in your path. Margaret was finding a partner who made everything better just by being there. Water solved, James said, bringing the story back to the present moment. But that wasn't the end of the challenges, not by half. Clayton II had finished his supper, pushing the plate aside with the satisfied look of a full belly. Sounds like great-grandmother was running the whole operation by then. She was running the parts your great-grandfather couldn't run himself. But that's what partnership means, boy. You each handle what you're best at, and together you cover all the ground. James stood, joints popping. Come on, we'll take coffee on the porch and I'll tell you about what happened next. About how Chester came back meaner and smarter. And about how your great-grandparents started to realize that what they had was more than just business. They settled back into the porch chairs, coffee mugs, steaming in the cooling evening air. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed their evening song, and the sounds of the ranch settling in for night created a familiar symphony. It was October when Chester showed up again, James began. Your great-grandfather was in Kansas City selling cattle, 3-day trip there and back. And Chester he'd been watching, waiting for exactly that kind of opportunity. The fall of 1878 came to Kansas with crisp mornings and afternoons warm enough to make a man sweat through his shirt. The garden Margaret had planted yielded pumpkins and squash, the chicken coop produced eggs like clockwork, and the ranch's financial ledgers showed profit for the first time in 2 years. Margaret had settled into a rhythm that felt less like work and more like purpose. Mornings in the cookhouse producing meals that kept the hands fed and happy. Afternoons managing supplies, negotiating with merchants, handling the paperwork that Clayton had neglected for years. Evenings in the office working the books alongside Clayton, their conversations ranging from cattle prices to childhood memories to the kind of comfortable silence that came when two people didn't need words to communicate. She'd stopped thinking of the ranch as Clayton's and started thinking of it as theirs, though she'd never said so out loud. Partners in business, certainly. Partners in purpose, undoubtedly. Partners in anything else. That question sat unexamined between them, present but unspoken. The hands had stopped seeing her as just the cook. When Tommy needed help writing a letter to his mother, he came to Margaret. When Sam's arthritis flared up in cold weather, Margaret was the one who made sure he had liniment and hot compresses. When disputes arose about work assignments or supply distribution, people came to her for arbitration as often as they went to Clayton. She'd become, without quite intending it, the heart of the operation. Clayton was the head making decisions about cattle and land and the physical work of ranching. But Margaret was the force that held everything together, that transformed a collection of men working for wages into something that felt almost like family. Clayton left for Kansas City on a Tuesday morning, taking 6 hands and 40 head of cattle to sell at the stockyards. The trip would take 3 days, minimum, maybe 4 if the buyers were slow. He'd made the journey twice a year for the past decade, routine enough that Margaret barely looked up from her inventory lists when he stopped by the cookhouse to say goodbye. "Need anything from the city?" he asked. "Better prices on flour would be nice, but I doubt you can negotiate that from a cattle buyer." Clayton grinned. "I'll see what I can do. Sam's in charge while I'm gone. Any problems, you go to him." "I'll be fine," Margaret said, and meant it. The ranch ran smooth enough now that 3 days without Clayton wouldn't even register as disruption. He hesitated at the door like there was something else he wanted to say, but finally just nodded and left. Margaret watched him ride out with the cattle, then returned to her work. She didn't see Chester Blake until it was too late to avoid him. It was Thursday afternoon. Clayton would be in Kansas City by now, selling cattle and probably staying at one of the cheap hotels near the stockyards. Margaret had finished the midday meal and was walking to the Mercantile in Linden to pick up supplies Frank Morrison had set aside for her. Chester stepped out of the saloon as she passed, and the smell of whiskey preceded him like advance warning. But unlike last time, he wasn't stumbling, drunk. He was sober enough to be dangerous, mean enough to be unpredictable. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying that edge of false friendliness that preceded violence. "If it isn't Maggie Hartwell, walking around town like she owns the place." Margaret kept walking, keeping her pace steady, not running but not engaging either. The Mercantile was 50 yards away. Frank Morrison was a decent man who wouldn't tolerate trouble in his store. 50 yards to safety. Chester matched her pace, staying just close enough to be threatening. "I'm talking to you, Maggie. Rude to ignore an old family friend." "You're not my friend, Chester, and you're not family. Leave me alone." "Can't do that. See, I've been thinking about our situation, about the money you owe me, about how you ran off to hide behind some rancher's money instead of facing your obligations." He moved in front of her, blocking her path. $300, Maggie. That's all I want. Pay up and I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." "I don't have $300, and even if I did, I wouldn't give you a penny of it." Margaret tried to step around him, but he shifted to block her again. "See, that's where you're wrong. I've been doing some research, asking around, and I learned some interesting things about your arrangement with Mr. Brennan." Chester's smile held malice. "You're not just the cook anymore, are you? You're his business manager, his partner, which means you've got access to ranch funds, access to money that could solve our little problem. That money isn't mine to spend on your delusions." "Delusions?" Chester's voice rose, drawing attention from people on the street. "You think Robert's debts are delusions? You think you can just walk away from your responsibilities?" Margaret saw people stopping to watch, saw curtains twitching in windows. Small-town gossip spread faster than prairie fire, and this confrontation would be the talk of Linden by sunset. She needed to end it now before it got worse. "The courts ruled on this, Chester. You have no legal claim. If you continue to harass me, I'll file a complaint with the sheriff." "The sheriff?" Chester laughed, but there was something desperate in it now, something that made Margaret's skin prickle with warning. "You go ahead and try that. But first, maybe you should see this." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, thrust it at her. Margaret took it, reflexively unfolded it, and felt her stomach drop. It was a promissory note, $300, dated 2 months before Robert's death, and at the bottom, clear as day, was her signature. "That's impossible," Margaret said, but her voice came out wrong, shaky. "I never signed this." "That's your signature, isn't it?" Chester's smile widened. "Looks pretty official to me, and I'm betting it'll look official to a judge, too. See you in court, Maggie, 1 month, county courthouse. Bring your fancy rancher and his money because you're going to need both." He walked away, leaving Margaret standing in the middle of the street holding a document that could destroy everything she'd built. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely refold the paper. She made it to the Mercantile through pure force of will, picked up her supplies in a daze, and rode back to the ranch with her mind spinning through possibilities. The signature looked like hers. The handwriting was eerily accurate. But she'd never signed any promissory note, never agreed to guarantee Robert's debts to Chester or anyone else, which meant either her memory was faulty, which she knew it wasn't, or Chester had forged the document. But if it was forged, it was the best forgery she'd ever seen. Back at the ranch, Margaret went straight to the cabin she'd made her own, pulled out every piece of paper she'd saved from her St. Louis life. Bank documents, letters, the few legal papers that had survived Robert's death, and the seizure of their property. She compared signatures looking for differences. They were identical. Every curve, every loop, every small idiosyncrasy that made her handwriting unique. If this was forgery, it was done by someone with exceptional skill. Tommy found her there an hour later, surrounded by papers, her face pale. "Mrs. Margaret, you all right? You missed starting supper." Margaret looked up, realized with a start that the light had changed, that she'd lost track of time completely. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I'll get it started now." "Want me to fetch Sam? You look like you've seen a ghost." "No, I'm fine. Just some personal business that caught me off guard." She gathered the papers, forced a smile that probably didn't convince anyone. "I'll have supper ready in 30 minutes. She cooked by rote, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind worried at the problem like a dog with a bone. The note was either genuine, which meant she'd signed it and forgotten, or forged, which meant Chester had access to someone with extraordinary skill. Neither option was good. Both options led to court, to a legal battle she might not win. Clayton returned Friday evening trail-worn and satisfied with the cattle prices he'd negotiated. He found Margaret in the office, staring at the promissory note like it might spontaneously combust if she looked hard enough. "What's that?" he asked, reading trouble in her posture. Margaret handed him the paper without a word. Clayton read it again, then looked up with eyes gone cold and hard. "Where'd you get this?" "Chester gave it to me yesterday, in town, in front of half of Linden." She met his gaze, willing him to believe her. "I never signed it, Clayton. I swear I never agreed to guarantee any of Robert's debts." "I believe you," he said, and the immediate certainty in his voice made something tight in her chest loosen slightly. "But believing you and proving it in court are different things. We need to figure out if this is real or forged, and we need to do it fast." He sat down at the desk, pulled out fresh paper, and started making lists. People to contact, evidence to gather, steps to take. Clayton Brennan facing a problem was Clayton Brennan in his element, calm and methodical and utterly focused. "I'm going back to St. Louis," he said. "First thing Monday, I'll check bank records, talk to people who knew Robert, find out if there's any truth to this note. That's a week of travel minimum, maybe more. Then it takes as long as it takes." He looked up, and something in his eyes made Margaret's breath catch. "You're not facing this alone. We're partners, remember? Your problems are my problems. This could cost the ranch, Clayton. If a judge rules in Chester's favor, if they decide I'm liable for this debt, they could seize partnership assets to satisfy the judgment. Let them try." His voice held steel. "I've got lawyers too, and I've got something Chester doesn't have." "What's that?" "The truth, and you." He reached across the desk, took her hand in his. "We'll figure this out, Margaret. Together." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that truth would win over fabrication, that justice would prevail over fraud. But she'd learned the hard way that wanting something didn't make it true, and sometimes the bad guys won just because they were willing to fight dirtier. "What if we can't prove it's forged?" she asked quietly. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I'm not giving up on you, Margaret, and I'm not letting Chester Blake take what we've built." He squeezed her hand once, then released it. "Now come on. Sam tells me you didn't eat supper, which means you're running on worry and coffee. That's no way to fight." They went to the cookhouse together, and Clayton made her sit while he heated up leftover stew. It was strange being cared for instead of doing the caring, and Margaret didn't quite know how to accept it. But she was tired, bone tired, and the stew was warm, and Clayton's presence across the table was solid and real and reassuring. "Thank you," she said when the bowl was empty. "For what? For believing me, for not assuming I'm trying to hide something or lying about the signature." Clayton shook his head. "I've worked with you for 4 months, Margaret. I've seen how you handle money, how you keep records, how you run operations. If you say you didn't sign that note, then you didn't sign it. Period." The simple faith in his words nearly undid her. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back hard. She'd cried once after Robert died, had sworn she was done with tears. But sitting across from Clayton Brennan, seeing his absolute certainty that she was telling the truth made her want to weep like a child. "I should get some sleep," she said instead, standing before the tears could break free. "Tomorrow's going to be busy." "Margaret," she turned at the door. "We're going to win this, I promise you that." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled to her cabin. Only there alone in the dark did she let the tears come. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from something else. From the realization that somewhere between arguing about chicken coops and negotiating with Sullivan and working side by side in the office, Clayton Brennan had become more than her employer. He'd become the person she trusted most in the world. And that trust, that faith, that partnership was worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible to win. James paused in his telling, watching his grandson process the story. The boy was leaning forward now, fully invested in a tale that had happened before his parents were born. "So Chester forged the note?" Clayton asked. "That's what they thought. But proving it was going to take time and money and expert help they couldn't easily afford." James stood, stretched his back. "This is a good place to pause. Get some rest. Tomorrow before you leave, I'll tell you how they fought back, how they turned Chester's scheme against him, and how your great-grandparents started to realize they weren't just partners in business anymore." Clayton stood too, but hesitated. "Grandpa, were you scared when you went to war?" "Terrified," James said honestly. "Every man with sense is scared before combat. But being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It means you understand what's at stake." He put his hand on Clayton's shoulder. "You've got Margaret Hartwell's blood in you, boy. The woman who faced down her past with nothing but determination and a partner who believed in her. You've got Clayton Brennan's blood, too, the man who rode to St. Louis to fight for truth when lying would have been easier. That's who you come from. That's the legacy you carry. I'll try to make you proud." "You already have," James said. "Now get some sleep. Story's not over yet, and the best parts are still to come." Clayton headed to his room, leaving James alone on the porch with the night sounds of the ranch and memories of parents who'd built something that would outlast them both. Tomorrow, his grandson would leave for war, carrying with him the lessons of partnership and courage, and the kind of quiet strength that won battles without firing a shot. But tonight, the story had reached its second act break, the moment when everything seemed darkest before the dawn. Tomorrow would bring the resolution, the trial, the truth emerging from shadow. Tomorrow would finish what had begun 72 years ago with a woman climbing down from a wagon. For now, there was just the night and the stars and the weight of history pressing down like a blessing instead of a burden. The morning of Clayton's departure came gray and cold November wind, rattling the windows of the ranch house and carrying the promise of early winter. James Brennan poured coffee for both of them, the pre-dawn darkness still thick outside, and settled back into his chair with the weight of a man preparing to finish what he'd started. "Your great-grandfather left for St. Louis the Monday after Chester showed that forged note," James said, picking up the thread of story like a weaver returning to interrupted work. "6-day trip minimum, maybe more depending on what he found. And your great-grandmother stayed here running the ranch, keeping everything together and trying not to think about what would happen if Clayton couldn't prove the forgery." Clayton II, dressed now in his travel uniform, packed beside the door, ready for the bus that would come with sunrise, leaned forward. "But he did prove it right. They won." "They won," James confirmed, "but not the way either of them expected. Let me tell you about the weeks that followed, about experts and trials, and the moment when everything hung on a criminal's conscience." The old man's voice dropped into story cadence, and the past opened one final time. Clayton Brennan rode out at first light on Monday, October 28, 1878, with Sam Tucker's worried expression following him to the gate and Margaret's brave face etched into his memory. 6 days minimum to St. Louis and back, assuming he found what he needed quickly. More likely 8 or 10, and every day away was a day Margaret would spend holding the ranch together while knowing a legal sword hung over both their futures. He pushed hard, making Kansas City in 2 days instead of the usual 3, catching a train east that ate the remaining distance in a fraction of the time horses could manage. St. Louis sprawled beside the Mississippi River like a promise of civilization after weeks in the Kansas prairie, but Clayton had no time for sightseeing or comfort. He went straight to the county courthouse, to the records office, where documents of debt and death got filed and forgotten. The clerk was a tired man with ink-stained fingers who looked at Clayton's request with the enthusiasm of someone asked to dig through years of poorly organized files. Robert Hartwell, deceased June 1878. You want all financial records. Everything. Debts, assets, court filings, anything related to money. It took 3 days of searching through dusty boxes and ledgers that smelled of mold and age. Clayton paid the clerk extra to work late to check files that hadn't been opened in months. And finally, in a box marked Miscellaneous Estate Documents, he found what he was looking for. A bank withdrawal slip from March 1877. Margaret's signature, clear and precise, authorizing withdrawal of $30 from a joint account. And in the margin, a clerk's note, original signature card on file verified March 15, 1877. Clayton held the slip up to lamplight, comparing it to the promissory note he'd brought from Kansas. The signatures were identical. Not similar, identical. Every loop, every flourish, every tiny variation that made handwriting unique. Which meant one thing: someone had copied Margaret's signature from this legitimate bank document and transferred it to the forged promissory note. But doing that required skill beyond what most forgers possessed. It required expertise, equipment, and knowledge of techniques that were cutting edge even in cities like St. Louis. Clayton paid the clerk for a certified copy of the withdrawal slip, then started asking questions. Who in St. Louis specialized in document work? Who had the skill to create forgeries good enough to fool bank officials? The answers led him to the seedier parts of the city, to print shops and photography studios that did work nobody asked too many questions about. And finally to a name that came up 3 times from 3 different sources: William Burke, document specialist. Wanted in Missouri and Kansas for fraud. Last known location unknown, but rumored to still be working in the region. Clayton spent another day tracking down people who dealt with Burke, gathering descriptions and details. The picture that emerged was of a professional criminal who specialized in exactly the kind of forgery that had targeted Margaret. Burke's signature technique involved photographing genuine signatures, then transferring them to new documents using a process that left almost no trace. But Burke had made one mistake. Every forger had to tell some small habit that marked their work. For Burke, it was the ink. He used a specific formulation slightly different in chemical composition from standard writing ink, detectable only through laboratory analysis. Clayton took the promissory note to a chemist who dealt with police matters, paid for a rushed analysis, and 3 days after arriving in St. Louis had confirmation. The ink on Margaret's signature differed from the ink on the rest of the document. Same color but different in chemical makeup. Professional forgery, detectable only through expert examination. He caught the train back to Kansas City with evidence in hand, then rode the final stretch home with a satisfaction that felt like victory before the battle was even fought. Margaret hadn't signed anything. Chester Blake had hired a professional forger to create false evidence, and Clayton could prove it. He reached the ranch on November 9th, having been gone 11 days instead of the expected 6. The sun was setting as he rode through the gate, and Margaret came running from the cookhouse apron, still tied around her waist, face showing the strain of days spent worrying. "You're back," she said, and the relief in her voice made the hard riding worth every aching muscle. "I'm back, and I've got what we need." He dismounted, pulling the envelope of documents from his saddlebag. "Let's go to the office. You need to see this." They spread the evidence across his desk. The withdrawal slip, the chemical analysis, the testimony from 3 people who'd identified Burke as active in St. Louis during the time period when the note would have been created. Margaret read through everything twice, her expression shifting from hope to certainty. "This proves it," she said. "This proves I never signed Chester's note. It proves the signature was forged. But there's a problem." Clayton leaned against the desk, fatigue finally catching up with him. "Burke is wanted in 3 states. Nobody knows where he is. Without him to testify or at least to confirm the forgery technique, we're relying on expert witnesses who've never examined the original document. Chester's lawyer could argue that our chemist is wrong, that the ink variation is natural, that we're manufacturing evidence. So we need Burke. We need Burke, or we need expert testimony so convincing that a jury won't need Burke to see the truth." Clayton rubbed his eyes, 2 weeks of travel and investigation pressing down like physical weight. "I've got the name of a handwriting analyst in Kansas City, Arthur Whitmore, best in the region, according to the chemist. Testified in 47 cases, never been successfully challenged. But he costs money. How much? $150 plus travel expenses. Margaret went pale. $150 was their entire cash reserve, everything they had saved from months of careful management. Using it would leave the ranch vulnerable, unable to handle emergencies or unexpected costs. But not using it meant fighting Chester without the best weapons available. We hire him, Margaret said. We spend whatever it takes to win this. It could bankrupt us. Being bankrupt and free is better than being solvent and in Chester's debt. She met his eyes, and Clayton saw steel there, the same determination that had brought her to Kansas with nothing but a carpetbag. Do it. Hire the expert. We'll figure out the money later. Clayton wanted to argue, wanted to find another way that didn't risk everything they'd built. But he knew she was right. Some battles you fought with everything you had, regardless of cost. All right, I'll write to Whitmore tomorrow. Trial is scheduled for December 15th. That gives us 5 weeks to prepare. 5 weeks that passed in a blur of preparation and worry. Arthur Whitmore arrived 3 weeks before the trial, a precise man in his 50s who examined the promissory note with tools that looked more surgical than clerical. Magnifying glasses, chemical reagents, measurement devices calibrated to detect variations invisible to normal sight. He spent 2 days examining the document, making notes in a leather-bound journal, occasionally grunting in what might have been satisfaction or might have been indigestion. Finally, on the evening of the second day, he called Clayton and Margaret to the office. This is professional work, Whitmore said, tapping the note with one ink-stained finger. Very professional, but like all forgeries, it has tells. He pulled out his magnifying glass, showed them details they'd never noticed. The slight blur around the signature edges suggesting it had been photographed and transferred. The chemical composition of the ink different from the rest of the document. Most damning tiny cutting marks visible only under magnification where the original signature had been excised from its source document. I can prove in court that this signature was transferred from another document, Whitmore concluded. I can demonstrate the technique, show the evidence, make it clear even to a layman. The question is whether the jury will believe science or their own prejudices. What prejudices? Margaret asked. Whitmore looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Hartwell, I'll be frank. You're a woman claiming you didn't sign a document that appears to bear your signature. Some jurors will assume you're lying to escape debt. Some will think a woman shouldn't be involved in business matters at all. My testimony can show the forgery, but I can't control how people interpret that evidence. Then we make sure the evidence is so clear they can't ignore it, Clayton said. Can you demonstrate the forgery technique in court? Show them exactly how it was done. I can, and I will. Whitmore closed his journal. But understand, Mr. Brennan, this won't be easy. Chester Blake's lawyer will attack my credibility question. My methods suggest I'm biased because you're paying me. You need more than just my testimony. What do we need? Character witnesses. People who can testify to Mrs. Hartwell's honesty and business acumen. Document the ranch's financial practices, show that she keeps meticulous records and wouldn't need to borrow money. Build a narrative that makes the idea of her signing this note ridiculous on its face. So they did. Sam Tucker agreed to testify about Margaret's character and her transformation of ranch operations. Sullivan surprisingly volunteered to speak about her business negotiations and integrity. Frank Morrison from the Mercantile would discuss her careful purchasing and payment practices. Tommy Harlow, young but earnest, wanted to testify about how she'd helped him learn better reading and arithmetic. The night before the trial, Clayton couldn't sleep. He walked to the barn at midnight, finding comfort in the familiar smell of hay and horses, and discovered Margaret already there, sitting on a hay bale, with her arms wrapped around herself. Couldn't sleep either, he asked. Too much thinking, too much worrying. She looked up, and in the lamplight her face showed every bit of the strain she'd been hiding for weeks. What if we lose Clayton? What if the jury doesn't believe Whitmore? What if they rule in Chester's favor? He sat beside her close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Then we figure out what comes next. We appeal. We fight. We don't give up. I'm scared, Margaret admitted, her voice small in the darkness. Not just of losing the money or the ranch. I'm scared of losing this. What we've built. What we've become. Partners, more than partners. She turned to face him fully. You know it's more than that. I know you know. We've been dancing around it for months, pretending it's just business, just convenience. But it's not. Clayton's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the conversation they'd been avoiding, the truth they'd both seen but neither had spoken. No, it's not. I told myself when I came here that I'd never depend on a man again. Never let anyone have power over my future. And now here I am, and my future is so tangled with yours that I can't tell where mine ends and yours begins. Is that a bad thing? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. It terrifies me, but it also feels right in a way nothing else ever has. She met his eyes. What are we, Clayton? He wanted to have an answer, wanted to offer certainty and clarity, but honesty mattered more than comfort. I don't know what to call it. All I know is that somewhere between you fixing my chicken coops and negotiating with Sullivan and working beside me every night, you stopped being my employee and became the person I can't imagine this ranch without. Can't imagine my life without. That sounds like more than partnership. It is more than partnership. He took her hand, feeling the calluses from work to strengthen her fingers. I love you, Margaret. I don't know when it happened or how, but there it is. I love you. The words hung between them, honest and raw. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back hard. I love you too, she whispered. And that scares me more than anything Chester could do, because I've been hurt before. I've trusted before and had that trust destroyed. What if this is a mistake? What if we ruin what we have by trying to make it something else? Clayton shifted, taking both her hands now. Or what if we make it better? What if partnership plus love equals something stronger than either alone? He paused, gathering courage for what came next. I'm not asking you to marry me. Not yet. Not while this trial hangs over us. But I'm asking permission to court you properly. To prove over time that I'm not Robert, that I'll never use you or hurt you or take advantage of your trust. Can you give me that chance? Margaret pulled one hand free, touched his face with a gentleness that nearly broke him. You've already proven it, Clayton. Every day since I arrived. Every time you trusted my judgment. Every time you stood beside me instead of in front of me. Every time you made me an equal instead of a subordinate. You've been proving it all along. Then what? Then kiss me, she said, and tomorrow we face Chester together. As partners, as whatever this is becoming. Clayton kissed her there in the barn with hay dust drifting in lamplight and horses breathing quiet in their stalls. It wasn't desperate or rushed, just honest. The kisses of two people who'd found each other through hardship and were choosing to face whatever came next side by side. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret was smiling, really smiling, in a way Clayton had never seen before. We should sleep. Big day tomorrow. Yeah, but neither of them moved, reluctant to break the moment. Clayton, regardless of what happens in that courtroom, thank you for believing in me, for fighting for me, for loving me when I thought I was done being lovable. You were never done, he said. You just needed to find someone who saw you clear. They walked back to the house together, parting at her cabin door with one more kiss that promised everything words couldn't quite capture. And Clayton went to his own bed feeling lighter than he had in weeks, almost optimistic, despite the battle that waited with morning. The county courthouse in Linden was built of red brick and stood 2 stories tall, the grandest building in town by a wide margin. December 15th dawned cold and clear, and the courtroom filled to capacity an hour before proceedings were scheduled to begin. Everyone in the county, it seemed, wanted to witness the trial of Margaret Hartwell. Clayton sat at the defendant's table beside Margaret and their lawyer, Samuel Henderson, a solid man in his 40s who specialized in civil disputes. Across the aisle, Chester Blake sat with his attorney, Marcus Finch, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and flexible ethics. Judge Morrison, no relation to the mercantile owner, called the court to order at 9 o'clock sharp. He was 60-something, stern-faced with a white beard that gave him the appearance of an Old Testament prophet. He'd been on the bench for 20 years and suffered neither fools nor frauds gladly. Mr. Finch, the judge said, present your opening statement. Finch stood smoothing his coat and addressed the jury with the practiced ease of a man who'd done this dozens of times. Gentlemen, this case is simple. Mrs. Margaret Hartwell signed a promissory note guaranteeing her husband's debt. Robert Hartwell died. The debt became hers by law and by honor. My client, Mr. Chester Blake, has waited patiently for payment. Now he seeks only what is rightfully his, $300. Nothing more, nothing less. He presented the promissory note as evidence, passing it to the jury foreman. You'll see Mrs. Hartwell's signature there clear as day. The defense may claim forgery, may bring in fancy experts with expensive equipment, but your eyes don't lie. That's her signature. She signed it. She owes it. Justice demands she pay it. Henderson stood for the defense, and his approach was different, quieter, more factual. Gentlemen, my client did not sign that document. What you're looking at is a professional forgery created with sophisticated techniques designed to deceive. We will prove through expert testimony and documentary evidence that this note is fraudulent. We will show that Mrs. Hartwell is a woman of impeccable character and careful business practices, someone who would never sign such a document. And we will demonstrate that Mr. Blake's claim is nothing more than an attempt to extract money through legal fraud. The prosecution went first. Finch called Chester to the stand, led him through testimony about his friendship with Robert, the supposed loan, Margaret's knowledge of the debt. Did Mrs. Hartwell know about the money her husband owed you? Finch asked. She did. She was there when Robert and I discussed it. She even said she'd help him pay it back. Chester looked at the jury with an expression of wounded innocence. I trusted her word, trusted her honor. And when Robert died, I gave her time to grieve before asking for payment. But she ran, came out here to hide behind Mr. Brennan's money. Henderson's cross-examination was surgical. Mr. Blake, you claim Mrs. Hartwell promised to help repay this debt. Do you have any witnesses to this promise? No, it was a private conversation. Do you have any letters or documents showing Mrs. Hartwell acknowledged the debt? No, everything was verbal. Do you have the original handwritten promissory note? Chester shifted in his seat. It was lost. What I have is a photographic copy. Lost? How convenient. Henderson let that hang for a moment. Mr. Blake, how much have you had to drink today? Finch objected. Judge Morrison sustained it, but the question had served its purpose. Several jury members were looking at Chester with new skepticism. The first day ended with Chester's testimony and the introduction of the promissory note into evidence. Margaret and Clayton returned to the ranch, exhausted, the weight of the trial pressing down like physical burden. The second day began with the defense case. Henderson called Margaret to the stand first, and she testified with the same calm directness she brought to everything else. Mrs. Hartwell, did you sign the promissory note in question? No, sir. I never saw that document until Mr. Blake showed it to me in October. Did you ever agree to guarantee your late husband's debts? No, sir. Robert's gambling debts were his own. I had no involvement in them. Can you explain how your signature came to be on this document? Someone forged it, copied it from another source, and transferred it to this note. Finch's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned her memory, her honesty, her motives. Isn't it true, Mrs. Hartwell, that you now co-own a profitable ranch, that you have means to pay this debt, but choose not to? I have no legal or moral obligation to pay a debt I never incurred. Isn't it convenient that you claim forgery only after becoming financially comfortable? I claimed forgery the moment I saw the note. My financial status is irrelevant to the truth. The real battle came with Arthur Whitmore's testimony. Henderson qualified him as an expert, establishing his credentials and experience. Then Whitmore took the jury through his analysis step by methodical step. This signature was not written by hand on this document. Whitmore explained, using a magnifying glass to show jury members the evidence. It was photographed from another source and transferred using a chemical process. You can see here these slight blurs around the edges. That's characteristic of photographic transfer. And here, under magnification, cutting marks, where the original signature was excised from its source. He presented chemical analysis showing the ink differences. He demonstrated how the forgery would have been executed. He made the science accessible, turning complex forensics into something a rancher or shopkeeper could understand. Finch fought back hard. Mr. Whitmore, you're being paid by the defense, correct? I'm being paid for my expert analysis, yes. $150, I understand, quite a sum. Doesn't that payment bias your testimony? I'm paid for my time and expertise, not for a particular conclusion. My analysis would be the same regardless of who hired me. But you've never actually met the person who created this alleged forgery, have you? No, but I've examined hundreds of forgeries in my career. I know the techniques that tells the evidence they leave behind. This document bears all the hallmarks of professional forgery work. The back and forth continued for 2 hours, Finch trying to undermine Whitmore's credibility, while the expert calmly defended his analysis. By the end, Clayton couldn't tell which way the jury was leaning. Some seemed convinced by Whitmore's science. Others looked skeptical of anything too complicated to see with naked eyes. Then came the character witnesses. Sam Tucker testified about Margaret's integrity and business acumen. Sullivan spoke about her negotiation skills and honest dealing. Frank Morrison discussed her careful financial management. Tommy, nervous but earnest, talked about how she'd helped him learn and grow. The picture that emerged was of a woman who kept meticulous records, paid her debts promptly, and conducted business with scrupulous honesty. A woman who had no need to borrow money and no reason to sign promissory notes. Court adjourned for the day with closing arguments scheduled for morning. Margaret and Clayton returned to the ranch in silence, both too drained for conversation. They sat in the office as lamplight pushed back darkness, not working, just existing in shared space. "How do you think it went?" Margaret asked finally. "I think we proved our case. Whether the jury believes it is another question." Clayton reached across the desk, took her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together." "Together," Margaret echoed and held tight to his hand like it was anchor in storm. The final day of trial began with closing arguments. Finch went first, appealing to simple logic and common sense. "That's her signature, gentlemen. Your eyes don't lie. The defense wants you to believe in complicated forgery theories and expensive expert testimony. But sometimes the simplest answer is the right answer. She signed it. She owes it. Do justice." Henderson's closing was different, built on the foundation of evidence and character. "Gentlemen, you've heard expert testimony proving this document is forged. You've heard from witnesses testifying to Mrs. Hartwell's impeccable character and business practices. You've seen that Mr. Blake has no credible evidence beyond a photographic copy of questionable origin. The question before you is simple. Do you believe science and character witness testimony, or do you believe a man with documented drinking problems making claims he cannot substantiate?" The jury retired to deliberate at 11 o'clock. Noon came and went. 1 o'clock. 2. The waiting was torture, each minute stretching like hours. At 3 o'clock, the bailiff emerged. "Jury's back." Everyone filed into the courtroom, tension thick enough to cut. The jury foreman, a weathered rancher named Bill Patterson, stood with a piece of paper in his hand. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked. "We have, Your Honor." "What say you?" Patterson looked at Margaret, and his expression was unreadable. "We find for the defendant. The promissory note is determined to be fraudulent. Mr. Blake's claim is dismissed with prejudice." The courtroom erupted. Margaret sagged in her chair, tears streaming down her face. Clayton pulled her close, not caring who saw, not caring what anyone thought. They'd won. Against odds and forgery and Chester's scheming, they had won. But the drama wasn't finished. Judge Morrison pounded his gavel for order, then turned to Chester with eyes gone cold. "Mr. Blake, based on evidence presented in this trial, I'm referring this matter to the county prosecutor for criminal charges of fraud and attempted theft. Bailiff, take him into custody." Chester Blake, who'd been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly came alive with rage. "This isn't over. You think you've won, but I'll be back. I'll make you pay. Margaret, both of you." The bailiff hauled him out, still shouting threats. But his words had no power anymore, just noise from a defeated man facing justice for his schemes. Outside the courthouse, Sullivan clapped Clayton on the shoulder. "Your lady won that fight clean. You're lucky to have her." "I know it," Clayton said, and looked at Margaret with everything he felt visible on his face. They rode back to the ranch in afternoon light that seemed brighter than it had any right to be. At the gate, Clayton stopped his horse. "Margaret Hartwell," he said formally, "I have a question to ask you." "Ask it." "Will you let me court you properly this time without legal battles hanging over us? Will you give me the chance to prove every day that you're the best thing that ever happened to me?" Margaret laughed, joy and relief and love, all tangled together. "You've already been courting me, you fool. Every time you stood beside me instead of in front of me. Every time you trusted my judgment. Every time you fought for us instead of just for yourself. So yes, court me, love me, build a future with me. Clayton dismounted, pulled her from her horse, and kissed her there at the gate where she'd first arrived 6 months ago. This time the kiss held no hesitation, no fear, just absolute certainty that they'd found what most people spent lifetimes searching for. Partnership that had become love. Love that made partnerships stronger. Two people who'd survive loss and hardship and come out the other side, ready to build something that would last. James Brennan paused, seeing dawn breaking pink and gold through the windows. His grandson sat across from him, coffee long, cold eyes bright with unshed tears. They got married in June of 1880, James said. Simple ceremony. Whole community came. Your great-grandmother wore cream instead of white, said she was too practical for a virgin white at 24. Your great-grandfather wore his best suit and looked like he'd won the lottery. And then, Clayton asked, voice husky. And then they built a life, James said. Not a fairy tale. A real life with work and struggle and joy mixed together. Let me tell you about the years that followed. The wedding was held on a June afternoon when the Kansas prairie bloomed with wildflowers and possibility. Margaret wore a dress of cream-colored silk she'd sewn herself over the course of 3 months, working late into the night and after finishing her daily duties. The bodice fit perfectly, the skirt moved like water when she walked, and when she looked at herself in the mirror on her wedding morning, she saw not the desperate widow who'd arrived 2 years ago, but a woman who'd built herself into something new. Clayton waited for her at the small church in Linden, surrounded by the ranch hands who'd become family and the community members who'd come to respect this unusual partnership. Sam Tucker stood beside him, serving as witness, his weathered face split by a grin. Tommy fidgeted in the front pew, his best clothes still looking slightly wrong on his lanky frame. When Margaret walked down the aisle on Sullivan's arm, the old rancher having offered to give her away since she had no family, Clayton felt his breath catch. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that. She was his partner, his equal, the person who had transformed not just his ranch, but his entire life. The ceremony was brief. The preacher kept it simple, understanding that these two people needed no elaborate vows when their actions had already spoken louder than any words could. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared held promise and partnership in equal measure. The celebration afterward at the ranch was raucous and heartfelt. Sam produced a fiddle that nobody knew he owned and played surprisingly competent dance music. Sullivan got pleasantly drunk and made a toast about how he'd never seen two more stubborn people find happiness, which made everyone laugh, including the bride and groom. Clayton waltzed with his new wife under the stars, surrounded by people who'd watched them build something real from nothing, and felt that everything he'd survived, all the loss and hardship and struggle, had been worth it to bring him to this moment. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and perfect, two people learning each other with patience and care. Margaret had been married before, but this was different. This was choosing, not settling. This was partnership, not ownership. And when she fell asleep in Clayton's arms in the big house that was now truly theirs together, she felt safe in a way she'd never experienced. Clayton lay awake longer, one arm around his sleeping wife, the other hand resting on her hip, and thought about Sarah. His first wife would always hold a place in his heart, the young love that had ended too soon. But Margaret was different. Margaret was the partner he needed, the strength that matched his own, the person who'd taught him that love didn't require perfection, just presence. The months that followed established new rhythms. Margaret moved into the main house, transforming it from bachelor quarters into a home. She hung curtains, planted flowers around the porch, filled the kitchen with the smells of baking bread and simmering stews. But she also kept her role in ranch operations, working side by side with Clayton on business decisions, managing the books, negotiating contracts. Some neighboring ranchers raised eyebrows at a wife who worked like a partner rather than keeping to domestic duties. But the Brennan Ranch's continued prosperity silenced most criticism. Hard to argue with success, and the success was undeniable. In the spring of 1881, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told Clayton one evening in the office where they'd spent so many hours building their partnership. He was working on breeding records for the horses when she set down her pen and said simply, "I'm going to have a baby." Clayton looked up, saw the mixture of joy and fear in her eyes, and understood both. Joy because they'd created this together. Fear because Sarah had died in childbirth, and that ghost still haunted them both. When he asked, July, I think, maybe late June, he came around the desk, pulled her to her feet, held her close. We'll get the best doctor. We'll be careful. We'll do everything right. I know. Her voice was muffled against his chest. I'm still scared. So am I, but we face it together, like everything else. The pregnancy progressed normally through spring and into early summer. Margaret continued working, modifying her duties as her body changed, creating systems that would allow the ranch to function smoothly even when she needed to step back. She trained Tommy to handle more of the bookkeeping, taught Sam the intricacies of supply ordering, made sure Clayton understood every aspect of operations he'd previously left to her. I'm not planning to ding, she told Clayton when he worried about all the preparation, but I am planning to be occupied with a baby for a while. The ranch needs to run without depending on me for everything. July came hot and dry, and Margaret's time drew near. The doctor from Linden, a competent man named Morris, who'd delivered half the babies in the county, examined her regularly and pronounced everything normal. But nothing about childbirth was normal when it finally began. The pain started before dawn on July 10, 1881. Margaret woke Clayton with a hand on his shoulder, her face calm, despite the tightness around her eyes. It's time. Clayton, dressed in record time, sent Tommy racing to town for Dr. Morris and stayed beside Margaret as the pains came faster and stronger. Sam's wife, Martha, who'd birthed 6 children of her own, came to help, bringing clean linens and calm competence. The labor went on for hours. Margaret paced the bedroom, gripping furniture during contractions, breathing through the pain with determination that reminded Clayton of everything he loved about her. She didn't scream or cry, just worked with the same focus she brought to every difficult task. Dr. Morris arrived at noon, examined Margaret, and pronounced the baby position correctly. Should be straightforward, he said. First babies take time, but everything looks good. But as afternoon faded into evening and evening into night, straightforward became complicated. The baby wasn't descending properly. Margaret's strength was flagging, and Dr. Morris's expression grew increasingly concerned. At midnight, he pulled Clayton aside. The baby's stuck. I'm going to have to use forceps. It's going to be rough on her, and there's risk. What kind of risk? To her or the baby? Maybe both. Morris didn't sugarcoat it. I'll do everything I can, but you need to be prepared. Clayton went back to Margaret, took her hand, saw the exhaustion in her face. Dr. Morris needs to help the baby along. It's going to hurt. Everything hurts already. She managed a weak smile. Just make sure I don't die, Clayton. I didn't come all this way to die having a baby. You're not going to die. I won't let you. The next hour was the longest of Clayton's life. Margaret's screams finally broke through her control as Dr. Morris worked with forceps, trying to guide the baby without causing more damage. Martha held Margaret's other hand, murmuring encouragement. Sam paced the hallway outside, and Clayton could hear the floorboards creaking under the foreman's worried steps. And then finally, a baby's cry split the night. It's a boy, Dr. Morris announced, holding up a squalling, red-faced infant. Healthy lungs on this one. But Clayton's attention was on Margaret, who'd gone frighteningly pale and quiet. Is she all right? Dr. Morris handed the baby to Martha and turned back to his patient. His hands moved quickly, checking pressing, and his face went grim. She's bleeding too much. Martha, I need those extra linens, now. The next minutes blurred together. Dr. Morris working frantically, Martha following his curt instructions, Margaret drifting in and out of consciousness, and Clayton holding her hand, willing for her to stay, to fight to live. Talk to her, Dr. Morris ordered. Keep her with us. Margaret, Clayton leaned close, his voice urgent. You hear me? You've got to stay. Our son needs you. I need you. You promised you wouldn't die, and you always keep your promises. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Tired. I know, but you don't get to quit now. You're the strongest person I know. You survived, Robert survived, Chester survived building a life from nothing. You can survive this. Baby. He's perfect. Got your stubbornness already the way he's yelling. But he needs his mother. Something shifted in her eyes, a spark of determination pushing through the exhaustion. Not dying. That's right. Not dying. Fighting. Dr. Morris worked for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes. Finally, his shoulders relaxed slightly. I've got the bleeding controlled. It was close, but I think she's going to make it. Clayton's legs went weak with relief. He stayed beside Margaret, holding her hand, watching color slowly return to her face. She drifted into real sleep, not the unconsciousness of blood loss, and Dr. Morris nodded approval. She'll need rest. Lots of it? No work for at least a month, maybe two. But she's strong, she'll recover. Martha brought the baby cleaned and swaddled and placed him in the cradle beside the bed. The infant had settled into sleep, tiny fists curled beside his face, completely oblivious to the drama his arrival had caused. Clayton looked at his son, this new life he and Margaret had created, and felt something vast and terrifying and wonderful open in his chest. Responsibility, fear, love, all mixed together in a way that made his hands shake. He spent the night in a chair beside the bed, unwilling to leave Margaret's side, checking every few minutes to make sure she was still breathing. Dr. Morris stayed too dozing in another chair, ready to intervene if complications developed. Dawn came gray and quiet. Margaret woke slowly, her eyes clearer than they'd been in hours. The baby took from home. Right here, healthy and loud. Clayton carefully picked up his son, brought him to Margaret. What should we name him? Margaret looked at the baby, touched his tiny hand with one finger. James, after your father. James Brennan. Clayton tested the name. I like it. James it is, then. She smiled, tired but genuine. Did I scare you? Terrified me. Don't do that again. Wasn't planning on it. Her smile faded. I really could have died, couldn't I? Dr. Morris said it was close. Another 10 minutes, maybe less. Clayton sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her. I thought I was going to lose you. Like I lost Sarah. But you didn't. I'm still here. We're still partners. Best partners I could ask for. He kissed her forehead gently. Now sleep. You've got recovering to do. Margaret's recovery took longer than either of them liked. 2 weeks before she could walk without pain. A month before she could resume light duties. 6 weeks before Dr. Morris pronounced her fully healed and approved her return to normal activities. But the experience changed something between them. Clayton had always known he loved Margaret, but watching her fight for life, fight to stay with him and their son, deepened that love into something almost sacred. And Margaret, who'd always prided herself on independence and strength, learned that accepting help didn't make her weak. It made her human. James thrived, growing into a robust baby with his father's strong features and his mother's dark eyes. He proved to have lungs that could wake the entire ranch when displeased, but he also had a sunny disposition that made the occasional midnight crying sessions bearable. Margaret managed motherhood the way she managed everything else, with competence and love in equal measure. She insisted on continuing to oversee the ranch's business operations, even with a baby in her arms. I didn't fight this hard for independence, just to lose myself in motherhood, she told Clayton when he suggested she might want to step back from her duties. I can be a mother and still be myself. Women have been managing both since the beginning of time. Clayton, who'd learned early in their marriage that arguing with Margaret when she had that particular tone in her voice was futile, simply kissed her and agreed, and she was right as usual. Margaret balanced motherhood and ranch management with a grace that seemed effortless, even though Clayton knew it was anything but. Young James became a fixture around the ranch, growing from infant to toddler, with a kind of fearless curiosity that gave his parents gray hairs. By age 3, he was following his father around the corrals, asking endless questions about horses and cattle. By age 5, he could ride a gentle mare and was learning to rope fence posts. In 1883, Margaret gave birth to twin daughters, Caroline and Elizabeth. These births were easier than James's, though still difficult enough that Clayton spent both deliveries pacing and praying. The girls arrived healthy and loud, and the ranch house filled with the chaos of 3 small children. The twins proved to have their mother's determined personality. Carolyn showed an early aptitude for numbers, often found helping her mother with the account books by age 4. Elizabeth had a gift with animals, able to calm nervous horses and befriend every dog and cat on the property. In 1887, Thomas arrived, the last of their children. His birth was the easiest of all, and Margaret recovered quickly, joking that she'd finally figured out how to have babies efficiently. Thomas, from his earliest years, showed an entrepreneurial streak that reminded everyone of his mother. At 6, he was organizing the other children's toys with systematic precision. At 8, he started raising chickens as a side business, carefully tracking income and expenses in a ledger that made Margaret laugh with pride. The ranch continued to prosper through the 1880s and into the 90s. Clayton's horse breeding program, which Margaret had encouraged him to develop, produced animals that won prizes at regional shows. Margaret's efficient management kept costs low and profits steady. Together, they expanded their operation, buying adjacent land, increasing their herd building, their reputation as honest dealers and skilled operators. But it was more than just business success that defined those years. It was the family dinners where four children argued and laughed. It was the evenings when Clayton and Margaret still worked side by side in the office now, with children doing homework at the same table. It was the community they'd built with the ranch hands who'd become extended family, the neighbors who came to Margaret for business advice and to Clayton for ranching wisdom. Sullivan became a regular visitor. His initial hostility transformed into genuine friendship. He never remarried after his wife's death, and the Brennan children adopted him as an honorary grandfather. Sam Tucker's children played with the Brennan kids, creating bonds that would last generations. The women's cooperative that Margaret had started in 1885 grew into a significant enterprise, providing income to dozens of families and creating a network of support that strengthened the entire community. Margaret taught business skills to women who'd never had the opportunity to learn, sharing the knowledge that had saved her own life. Clayton watched his wife transform not just their ranch, but their entire region, and his pride grew with each passing year. This was the woman he'd taken a chance on, the desperate widow who'd shown up with nothing but skills and determination. And she'd built an empire not through aggression or ruthlessness, but through competence and partnership. In 1905, when Clayton was 52 and Margaret was 49, Dr. Morris delivered news that changed everything. "Your heart's not as strong as it should be, Clayton. You need to take things easier, reduce stress, accept that you can't work the way you did when you were younger." Clayton told Margaret that evening, and she immediately began reorganizing ranch operations to reduce his workload. James, now 24 and married to a neighbor's daughter, took over the day-to-day cattle management entirely. Thomas, at 18, stepped up to handle tasks that required physical effort. "I feel useless," Clayton complained one afternoon when Margaret insisted he rest instead of helping repair a fence. "You're not useless. You're a man with a heart condition who needs to be sensible." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "We've built this ranch to run without depending on any one person. Let it work the way it was designed to work." Clayton grumbled, but obeyed and gradually adjusted to his new limitations. He focused on the horses, which required less physical labor, and spent more time on the business planning that had always been his and Margaret's shared passion. If anything, their partnership deepened during this period as they relied on each other even more fully. Margaret handled the physical oversight of operations, consulting with Clayton on major decisions. He provided the wisdom of experience, while she provided the energy of execution. Together, they continued to guide the ranch toward prosperity. The years from 1905 to 1917 were good ones despite Clayton's health concerns. James and his wife Sarah had two children, giving Clayton and Margaret grandchildren who filled the ranch with new life and laughter. Carolyn married a banker from Kansas City, but maintained her connections to the ranch, visiting regularly and bringing her business expertise to help modernize their operations. Elizabeth married one of the ranch hands and stayed on the property, continuing to build the horse training business into a significant profit center. Thomas married a smart young woman from town and took over more and more of the ranch's daily operations. Clayton Brennan died peacefully in his sleep on a October night in 1917. He was 64 years old, and Margaret was beside him where she'd been every night for 37 years. She woke to find him gone, the stillness of his body unmistakable in the pre-dawn darkness. For a long moment, she just lay there, her hand still resting on his chest, feeling the absence of heartbeat like a physical wound. Then she rose, dressed, and walked out to watch the sunrise from the porch where they'd spent so many evenings together. Sam found her there an hour later, her face dry, but her eyes holding a grief too deep for tears. "He's gone," she said simply. Sam nodded, his own eyes wet. "Want me to send for the doctor?" "In a bit. Let me sit with him first." She went back inside, sat beside her husband's body, and talked to him one last time. "You gave me everything, Clayton. A chance when I had nothing. Partnership when I expected servitude. Love when I thought impossible. We built something good together. Something that will last." She touched his face, cold now, but still beloved. "I'll miss you every day. But I'll be all right. You built me strong enough to carry on. Just like you promised you would." The funeral 3 days later was attended by hundreds of people, testament to the respect Clayton had earned in the community. But it was Margaret's eulogy that everyone remembered, her voice strong despite her tears, as she spoke of the man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, who'd loved her, not despite her strength but because of it, who'd been her partner in every sense of the word. "He was my heart," she said simply, "and I was his. We built something beautiful together, and it will endure long after we are both gone." Margaret lived for another 13 years after Clayton's death, continuing to manage the business side of the ranch with undiminished competence. She saw her grandchildren grow into adults, welcomed great-grandchildren, and continued to be a pillar of the community. She never remarried. When asked why, she always said the same thing: "I had my partnership. I had my love. Nothing could replace that." But everyone who knew her understood that part of her was waiting to rejoin the man who'd been her partner and her love for nearly 4 decades. She died peacefully in the summer of 1930 at the age of 74, surrounded by the family she and Clayton had created together. Her last words, spoken with a smile, were simple and clear: "I'm coming, Clayton." They buried her beside him on the hill overlooking the ranch, and the headstone they'd already prepared years ago read simply, "Margaret Hartwell Brennan, 1856 to 1930. She came to cook and ended up running everything, including his heart." James Brennan stood at the window now, watching the sun paint the Kansas prairie in shades of gold, and finished his story. The ranch continued for generations after them, managed by their descendants, who'd learned from their example the value of competence, determination, and the kind of partnership that makes anything possible. The systems she established, the relationships she built, the community she strengthened, all of it endured as testament to what one woman with courage and intelligence could accomplish when given the chance. He turned back to his grandson. "And on quiet evenings when the sun sets over this land that Clayton and Margaret worked together to build into something lasting, their great-grandchildren that tell stories about the remarkable woman who arrived in a dusty wagon looking for work and ended up creating a legacy that spans generations." Clayton II stood moved to his grandfather's side. "She came to cook for the ranch hands and ended up running everything, including his heart," James finished. "That's the important part, the partnership, the love, the building together instead of trying to go it alone." He pulled the yellowed envelope from his pocket one more time. "Your great-grandmother wanted you to have this, to carry it with you to Korea, to remember where you come from when things get hard." Clayton took the letter, reread the words he'd already memorized. "To my great-grandchildren. If you're reading this, you face something difficult. War, loss, fear, uncertainty. I want you to know I understand. When I came to Kansas in 1878, I had nothing but a carpetbag and determination. I was scared, alone, uncertain. But I did 3 things. I worked harder than fear told me to. I trusted despite past pain. I built something bigger than myself. Those 3 things saved me. Built family, created legacy. Do the same. Work hard, trust wisely, build always. And remember, strength is an absence of fear. Strength is acting despite fear. You come from survivors, from builders, from people who faced impossible odds and won. You carry that blood, that legacy, that strength. Now go, do what must be done. Come home safe, and build your own legacy. With love, your great-grandmother, Margaret." Clayton folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his uniform pocket over his heart. "I'll keep this with me, always." They heard the bus approaching, diesel engine loud in the morning quiet. Clayton picked up his pack, turned to his grandfather one last time. "Thank you for the story, for the letter, for showing me what real strength looks like." "Just come home," James said, his voice rough. "Come home and build your own legacy. Make them proud." They embraced a long moment of connection between generations. Then Clayton climbed aboard the bus. He found a window seat, waved as the vehicle pulled away, and James watched until dust obscured the road. The old man turned back to the ranch, to buildings and land that had stood for 72 years, built by a woman who came to cook and a man who gave her partnership. Their legacy lived on in every fence post and barn beam, in every system Margaret had created, and every value she'd taught. The sun climbed higher, burning off morning chill, painting the prairie in light that Margaret and Clayton had watched together for decades. Somewhere they were together again, watching over what they'd built, proud of the great-grandson who carried their letter into war and their strength in his bones. The story was finished. The legacy continued, and the ranch stood as it always had, testament to what two people could build when they chose partnership over pride, trust over fear, love over loneliness. James Brennan walked back to the house, leaving the past on the porch where it belonged, carrying forward only what mattered. The story of the woman who came to cook for the ranch hands and ended up running everything, including his father's heart. Some stories ended. Some stories never stopped, just passed from generation to generation, carrying wisdom and strength, and the knowledge that love and partnership could conquer anything if you were brave enough to try them.